Well, good afternoon, everybody. This is Dr. Mike Talbot, and you're welcome to join us this afternoon for our webinar on using mediation in higher education. So it's a rainy afternoon in Derbyshire. We're delighted to see there's so many people on this afternoon on our webinar from the UK and from around the world. So you're very pleased to join us as we talk about the use of mediation in the higher education sector within universities in particular. Just before I give you an overview, just going to say a couple of words about me. I'm Dr. Mike Talbot. I founded UK Mediation just over 20 years ago, having been a psychotherapist for 12 years or so, and have brought to the field my ideas about how to build in some of the principles and practice of psychotherapy into the processes that we use for resolving conflict. So what our organisation does is resolve conflict in all settings, helping people to reach informal or pre-formal settlements to all kinds of disputes, from workplaces, neighbourhoods, within families who are trying to stay together, within complaint scenarios, medical mediation settings, and in the university sector. So that's what we're talking about today, is the use of mediation within the university sector. So we're going to talk about some places where conflict can occur. I've got some statistics for you, including some very up-to-date statistics about the incidence of conflict in the higher education setting, and then I want to say a little bit about mediation and what it's all about. Some of you will be familiar with mediation. I notice on our list we've got a lot of people on today who are actually trained as mediators, and some people who are brand new to the field. So I'm just going to cover very briefly some of the principles of mediation and talk about where it fits in with the kind of processes you might be more familiar with in the university setting. So processes for dealing with staff-staff disputes, staff-student disputes, student-student type disputes, and also looking at dealing with complaints. So we'll talk about how mediation works, what it is about this process that actually can bring about resolution to complaints and disputes that would otherwise go through formal processes. How does it work, basically? And then the areas where we can apply mediation. We've got a video case study from an associate of ours, a long-standing friend of the company at one of the UK universities, and then talking about how to implement mediation into your organisation. So if you're watching us live, as we go through these topics, you're very welcome to comment or question in the chat box that you should have on your screen. So if you're watching through YouTube, it's the chat box down there. Just as we go along, feel free to comment or question. I'll stop at convenient points. There'll also be a few minutes at the end after I've talked for about 40 minutes, I hope. A bit of a slot at the end there for us to address any questions or have a bit of discussion about the contents that you're about to hear. So here we go. We're talking about conflict in the HE setting, and in particular, let's have a look at some statistics. So we start with students talking about their accommodation. Here's some happy students in a lovely flat at their university. And the kind of things that can happen amongst students, fallouts, personality clashes, etc. 90% of students report at least one problem with their accommodation. Now this might be if they're in a rented house down in town, it might be to do with their landlord or landlady, but if they're in student halls, it might be to do with their fellow residents. 90%, that's a very high figure, report at least one problem with their accommodation, and that was in the Save the Student publication, which is a student publication just from last year. In terms of complaints against universities, we have some statistics there as well. From the OIA last year, there was nearly 2,000 complaints received by the university's watchdog in 2018. So what happens with the university's watchdog is that they will pick up complaints that aren't dealt with internally. What we're trying to do with mediation in relation to the OIA is to help people to resolve things internally so it doesn't have to go to the watchdog. And the watchdog will often send things back and say, we'll try and resolve this internally. And one of the processes that they would encourage people to use is mediation. So trying to resolve complaints within universities without them going to the watchdog, but still in the last full year for which there are statistics, there's nearly 2,000 complaints that got through to the university's watchdog. Might be to do with changes in culture in the sector. Certainly the expectations of students have moved and shifted over the last 5 or 10 years. It may be indicative of that, but there we go, there's quite a high figure. And then talking about staff within university sector, 13% of HE staff say that work relationships are always strained. I was interested when we came across this figure. It's a little bit more dated than some of the figures we've got, but that's quite a high figure really. That's sort of 1 in 7 or so HE staff will say that work relationships are always strained. That's not just the odd tiff or the odd problem with a colleague. That's saying that it's pervasive. And then moving on, just one more statistic, a very recent one, bang up to date. This was in a publication just last week. We did a LinkedIn post on it. It's about a fifth of the University of Cambridge staff have been subjected, they say, to bullying or harassment, which is quite scary really when you think about that's 1 in 5 people in this world-renowned HE institution have been subjected, in their own opinion, to bullying or harassment. One of the things in the article that we saw, which was from Unison and the University of Cambridge, is that they are trying to use mediation to mitigate some of these issues and to try and nip them in the bud. But that's quite scary that there's still in 2020 1 in 5 people in University of Cambridge have been subjected to this kind of treatment. So there's some statistics, that's the size of the problem if you like. So let's talk a little bit about what mediation is. So it's not meditation, contrary to popular opinion, it is a process by which a mediator stays impartial in order to attend to the resolution of a dispute. So the mediator is not taking a view, they're not adjudicating, they're not arbitrating, it's not an investigation process. We are impartially attending to the needs of all parties in a dispute. I say all parties because it can be a one-on-one dispute, or quite commonly in the university sector, we're dealing with teams of people, 4 or 5 people, right up to larger groups of people within a department or a faculty. The mediator's job is to stay impartial, not to take anybody's side or to make any judgment about who's right or wrong, but to stay equally attentive to everybody's needs within the process. We use a staged process. We keep order in order that the language is appropriate, that nobody gets personally attacked. We may have issues with one another's behaviour within a team or in a one-to-one dispute, and it's the behaviours that we want to pay attention to. We are specifically ensuring that there's nothing persecutory or that the order isn't compromised by people making personal attacks or being personally abusive or name-calling. And we use a staged process, so we move through a series of steps and stages, which allows the mediator to have this route map, this way of navigating their way through people's conflict in order that they can get to the point where they reach their own preferred solution. So it's not about the mediator telling them what he or she thinks they should do. It's about the parties being facilitated to come up with their own preferred solution, what they need to do in order to move on from their conflict, or sometimes to prevent a dispute from developing. So depending on which sort of stage we are invited or the mediators are invited to get involved, we might be actually resolving a dispute that is happening or we may be working with a group in order to head off a dispute and to make sure that that dispute doesn't develop into something serious or dysfunctional. And the other thing that the mediator does is to refrain from solution giving. It can be tempting, excuse me, to give solutions. It can be tempting to say, well, why don't you do this or that? But we're actually holding off that in a big way on the simple basis that people don't like being told what to do. And I think it's quite condescending really to suppose that as mediators we can go in and look at a situation and say, oh yeah, I can see what you need to do. It's never true and never helpful. So it's all about making sure that the people involved have their, are empowered to actually come up with the solution themselves. And in order for that to happen, one of the things that's really important is voluntary participation. So they have to agree to participate. And if they are frog-marched into the process, or if they're cajoled into taking part, I can promise you on the basis of 20 years experience and having done around 1,200 mediation cases that it simply is not going to work and there's nothing that the mediator can do. So we cannot force people to take part in mediation. It's really important that their participation is voluntary, that they agree to participate and that they come into the process in good faith with an intention to resolve their dispute and to mend their working relationships. And without that, it's really not going to work. They need to abide by some ground rules, so it's important that the mediators have a set of ground rules that parties are prepared to sign up to. And one of the most important of these is the confidentiality. So we keep it private so that people can speak openly and honestly and they can say what's really on their mind and get to the heart of the dispute. And the other ground rules include there's no retention of notes, the mediator doesn't disclose anything either between parties or back to the organisation, and also some agreement about taking it in turns to speak, and some of the stuff that I said already about language. The people involved are expected to be open and honest with each other, and we do have a written confidentiality agreement in which we say to people, you know, this is our understanding that this is to resolve a dispute, and we are prepared to be open and honest and try and speak our minds and say what's going on. And without that, if people just come into the mediation process and look at their shoes and don't participate fully, then again, it's really not going to work. So we have this expectation that it's voluntary participation, people are going to work within some rules, and that they are going to be frank and honest with each other. So that's what mediation's about, a very whistle-stop tour there through the nuts and bolts of mediation, just for those of you who are with us today who are less familiar with those processes. And also sometimes people who are more familiar with processes may have a different take on what mediation is. And certainly, again, even though I've been doing this for 21 years, I do notice that there are a few varieties of dispute resolution which people are still calling mediation, which to my mind are not mediation. They seem to involve some investigative processes of report writing and getting people to make written statements about their positions, of the practitioner actually making judgments about who's right or wrong, and in some cases providing what I would call evaluative settlement conferencing, of actually weighing up the merits and the strengths of claims on various sides of a dispute. That's not mediation. So even for those of you who are more familiar with these processes, be aware that there are processes that people are calling mediation which really are not. So that's what it's all about. Let's talk about where it fits in. So where does mediation slot in relation to other types of conflict resolution? So my comments sort of segue into thinking about mediation vis-a-vis different sorts of processes. So negotiation is something that we're all quite familiar with, and if you have people who are prepared to go for a cup of tea and have a conversation and sort out a disagreement that they have, and they don't need that support of an impartial third party, then we'll call that negotiation. We could call it a chat over a cup of tea. And a lot of disputes or disagreements that arise can be sorted out this way. And of course in the HE sector and in academia in general, you know, challenge is encouraged. This is how we have productive debate. This is how we present differences of opinion. This is how we come up with new ideas. This is how we innovate, is to have people with different opinions, different views, coming into lively debate, and in order to have their conversation, if they don't need an impartial third party to make it happen, we'll just call that a chat or negotiation. Then the second one, where mediation slots in, this is where an impartial third party needs to get the conversation going. Either they've got to an impasse where they can't have any kind of a productive conversation, or somehow there is a contentious issue that keeps bubbling up and that they can't get past, the boulder in the road, as we sometimes call it, or for some reason it's around personalities or the psychology of the parties, which means they're unable to have a productive negotiation, or one party is a more skilled or a more persuasive negotiator. In those cases, that's when it's really useful to get a mediator involved. But what we're not doing is arbitrating. So this is the process that I alluded to a minute ago. This is where somebody who has some expertise in the area of the dispute, they get involved and they determine how the dispute should be ended. So arbitration is about, or soft arbitration I would call it. This is a process that's quite familiar in universities, which is where you would go to a manager or somebody in HR or somebody in the registry, and that person would listen to the two sides of the argument and would then propose how the dispute should be ended. It's perfectly valid, I'm not knocking it. And for certain disputes within universities, particularly around exam appeals or arbitration, or stuff to do with mitigating circumstances, or stuff to do with attendance, or things that are going to compromise the normal running of an education programme, quite often if there's a complaint about that, this arbitrative process is possibly the more appropriate one. It's not always about perceptions and people's interpretation of events. Sometimes it's about the facts, and we need to look at what's possible to be resolved within the university's regulations, and sometimes it's quite appropriate that this should be done in the registry or in student services when an expert determines what should happen on the basis of the university's policies. It's quite appropriate when it's less to do with personalities and less to do with an interpersonal fallout, that we could use this other thing, arbitration. And then the last one really is about litigation or enforcement. This is when there's a challenge to the rules, when somebody is alleged to have breached the rules or regulations, and when it's about rights and wrongs, we're testing whether somebody has in fact plagiarised or copied or cheated, when we're testing whether somebody is in flagrant breach of the regulations about their student accommodation or something to do with attendance, and we're actually testing whether the rules have been broken. And they're tested in a win-lose manner. So you either are or you are not in breach of the rules. You either are or are not guilty of a misconduct. So this is when we get into a more enforcement type area. And that's what we're doing when we get to that sort of level. So 4 things there: negotiation, people talking stuff out for themselves; mediation, which is when we help some 2 or more people to have that conversation; arbitration or soft arbitration, when the solution to a dispute is determined by an expert; and then the litigation enforcement stage, which is where we're getting the rule book down off the shelf and saying, well, did you or didn't you break the rules? And they're the different sorts of conflict resolution. So let's zoom in a little bit on the mediation one. I've talked about what it is and what it isn't. So let's have a look a little bit under the bonnet and have a think about how mediation works. Well, the thing is about mediation is it's all about the participants. It's about the people having a lot of say about how the process runs, what gets talked about, where they get to, what the resolution is at the conclusion of the process. So with regard to that, quite often there's a tension, there's an emotional tension, there's a pent-up frustration, there's an anger that people are either failing to express or they're expressing in the wrong way. And quite often this is all about the tension that builds up when you have a serious disagreement with somebody, and it's very hard to navigate that disagreement. A lot of us are frightened of conflict. It's not a pleasant thing to have a conflict with somebody, particularly if you've had a good relationship with them in the past. So what we've got within mediation, within the sort of containment that mediation offers, is you're allowing the participants to release that tension, to defuse the anger and the frustration in a non-damaging way, to talk to others about their behaviours, to talk to others about how they feel they've been impacted by that other person's behaviours, so that you get to hear how another person has been affected by your words and behaviours, they get to hear how you've been affected by their words and behaviours. When we get that out of the way and we can start to think a bit straighter, or when we start to express emotion in a less persecutory and a more constructive way, then we can get to the point where we're building dialogue. And this is what we're all about really as mediators, is we're trying to get people talking. We're trying to get people to take part in a constructive and future-focused exchange of their different views. We're not arguing about the past and what did or didn't happen and whether it was on a Tuesday or a Wednesday or it happened 4 times or 5 times. We're interested in saying, what are we going to do differently? How can we adjust our behaviours, what we do and what we say, how we conduct ourselves, so that from this point onwards we're not going to get into these same kind of wrangles. So this is where we are with dialogue. We're encouraging people to speak for themselves. We're encouraging people to look the other parties in the eye, to have a frank and honest exchange with the help of the mediator within some rules, and to have an exchange of their different views, which may remain different, but we still want to ensure that we get to a behavioural agreement so that their different views can be expressed in a constructive way and not in a destructive way. That's what we're trying to do. And one of the processes, one of the techniques we use in mediation, and those of you who are on today who've trained in mediation, here's a little bit of revision for you, is to come up with a shared resolution between all the parties using reframing, because what we're doing when we're in dispute is we tend to attribute blame and fault. You know, if I had an argument with somebody, I wouldn't go in there and say, you know what, it's all my fault, this argument. Well, I might, but that's me. But a lot of people would say, no, it's your fault, you're to blame. You did this, you did that. It's all down to you. It's not down to me. And it's something that we do, joking aside, I think I would perhaps do it defensively in some arguments, because it's hard to admit that we're the guy who's in the wrong. It can be quite shamey, it can be quite exposing to say, actually, I screwed up, I messed this up, I did things wrong, I shouldn't have done X, Y, Z. We tend to also refer to past events. It's important to us, I think, in the psychology of conflict, to think about backing up my version. So I will give you selectively a revisionist version of the history of how we've arrived at the current moment, and my selection and my revisions of what's happened will tend to back up my story, my narrative, so that I'll end up being in the right. And this is what we are inclined to do. And of course, when two people do that, their stories diverge, and you can end up with diametrically opposite interpretations of events. Even though the events are the same, the interpretations and the selective revisionist versions of those events will end up being diametrically opposite, so you end up with the two parties being completely at loggerheads. So we tend to talk about past events. We also tend to talk about what we say has got to happen. And we notice this when disputes have gone on for a long time before they come into mediation, is that the two parties or more parties have all got their own prescription for what needs to happen in order to bring this dispute to a close. Because we think about it a lot, conflict can keep us awake at night, we talk to friends, we go on the internet, and we end up with our own prescription for what's got to happen. So this is where we tend to start in a conflict, and this is where we would tend to be when mediators come across a dispute, hearing people blame each other, attribute fault to the other party, talk all about the history, including bringing along printouts of hundreds of emails and various other pieces of written evidence from their point of view, and also restating positions and asserting their positions of saying what has to happen. What we're doing as mediators, we're trying to get people away from this place of blame and fault, which is perfectly understandable, but to help them into a place of thinking about a shared responsibility to make this situation better. So one way of thinking about this is, instead of people banging their heads together and trying to prove who's right and wrong, we try and get them to put their heads together and realise that it's a shared responsibility for making the situation better, even though they don't agree about who's to blame. The other aspect of reframing is about moving people away from their revisionist versions of past events and into an agreement about future actions. So even though they're not going to agree about the past, they may get to a place where they feel inclined to agree about what they're going to start to do differently starting tomorrow. And getting people away from their entrenched positions, the standoff that we can get into, the sort of binary opposition that we can end up having with a party with whom we're in dispute, and instead we look at their underlying interests. And what we mean by interests in mediation is the people's underlying needs and motives and imperatives. And if we can, as our impartiality would imply, if we can help people to equally satisfy their interests and get a sense of satisfaction of their needs and motives and imperatives equally on both sides, and then come up with a solution that actually achieves that goal, this is where we get to a resolution in most mediation cases. So this is what reframing is all about. Done it very quickly there, but we're trying to get away from the inevitable and understandable place of blame and fault, past events and positions, to get people to move into a place where they understand there's a shared responsibility for making things better, that what they can agree about are future actions, even if they can't agree about past events, and to look at satisfying their underlying needs and motives and imperatives, rather than either of them winning by having their position backed up or made into action. So let's have a think about then, back to the HE sector in particular, and talking about what sort of HE disputes mediation can resolve. So having done this for a rather long time and worked with a lot of universities up and down the UK, the sorts of things that happen are disputes between students. So these smiling, happy students don't appear to be in any kind of dispute, but what can happen is that we get students coming into university courses who've maybe done their A-levels all on their own with very little teamwork or working within groups. What often happens in undergraduate courses is that students are expected to put their heads together and work within work groups of 3, 4, 5 students working on a piece together. There are options within universities to undertake study skills tuition. There is help available within a lot of universities to learn how to do this better. But if people don't avail of that support, they can end up getting into some right disputes and conflicts with fellow students when they have to try and collaborate within work groups. They're just not used to it, they don't know how to do it, get thrown in together with other students that they don't necessarily know very well, people of different abilities who work in different ways and at different paces, and they can end up falling out. Another thing is about residence and accommodation disputes, so not uncommon, especially in the first year when students are away from home for the first time. We may have people with different lifestyles, people with different expectations, different standards of hygiene, often the little disputes about who drank my milk or stole my pasta, down to people being kept awake at night by others who are very noisy, people's study time being compromised by other students who are partying, general mess, general lifestyle issues. These seem to be ubiquitous within halls of residence, like I say, particularly in the first year. Personality clashes, students just fall out with each other. And social media's got a lot to answer for with this. There is definitely a correlation between social media usage and these ideas about ganging up on people. We've seen how it can go across the various social media platforms, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. People start writing persecutory messages about each other, rumours, gossip about parties, misinterpretation of events, photographs that are taken without consent or shared without consent. This really fuels these personality clashes now, and it has come in some cases to physical violence between students, where things have been said about them or rumours have been spread about them. Some quite serious stuff, including police involvement, where parties fall out with each other, fueled very much these days by what can happen over social media. Relationship fallouts, pardon me. So, relationships that end or fail, groups that break up, people feeling that like they're being ganged up against or ostracised from a group. These are common between students. And of course, allegations of bullying or harassment. And coming back to the University of Cambridge figures that I mentioned early on, that was about staff, but actually there are also quite scarily high figures to do with the incidence of bullying, harassment amongst students. Again, a lot to be attributed to social media. And the last one there is about allegations of discrimination. This is people from different backgrounds, cultures, ethnicities, sexualities, coming into halls together, coming into places of learning together, and being treated poorly on the basis of aspects of difference, what we would call protected characteristics. And some very scary and some quite upsetting situations we've come across where people have been treated very poorly on the basis of certain personal characteristics. This is another thread, another theme of the sorts of disputes that can happen between students. As well as that, of course, we can have disputes between students and staff. The kind of thing that comes up is criticisms of the quality of teaching, where students have a beef about the quality of lecturing or the quality of teaching that they're on the receiving end of. Lack of academic support happens at all levels within universities. I think a lot of them that we've come across are to do with postgrad students who've got complaints about their supervisors. Accusations of inappropriate behaviour, which can be unwelcome attention from lecturers or unwelcome attention from students to lecturers actually, or other inappropriate behaviour, things that can happen again over social media, or conduct between staff and students which is unwelcomed or is simply over the line. Again, perceptions of unfair treatment. So it works both ways, this one, where academic staff are being singled out by groups of students, but also where individual students feel as if they've been singled out and been treated unfairly. So they're the kind of things that can happen between students and staff. And then, of course, we've got the the workplace disputes between staff. So these are sort of staff disputes. The kind of things that can be complained about include management style. People don't like the way they've been managed. Grievance type issues where there are complaints around conduct. Low-level bullying and harassment, really, which is... These terms get bandied around quite a lot, but quite often when we scratch the surface of situations where these things are alleged, often it comes down to having a good conversation in private with an impartial third party present. So all those three things that you see on the screen there are commonly addressed through mediation, but they commonly occur between members of staff. The classic communication breakdown, and then when we're talking more than just one-to-one disputes, we have issues with group dynamics as well. So where we have teams or faculties or departments within the university, it can be around group dynamics amongst 4, 5, 6, 7 people. These things can give rise to disputes. So they're all the sorts of things that can be addressed using mediation. So stuff between students and staff, and then disputes between members of staff. I've done that a bit quickly so that we can get on to hearing about actually a real case study. A friend and associate of the university that we've been working with for quite some time is Samantha Burkitt, who's the head of people and OD at Liverpool John Moores University. Samantha's going to talk about some of her experiences of actually using a mediation service. Sorry, it sounds a little bit promotional, this video, but it's her talking about working with UK Mediation over the years and how they've incorporated mediation into their practices.
So we've been using the services of UK Mediation for about 8 years now, and it's been really effective. We've built really good relations with the mediators, with Becky, who's our caseworker. And what it allows us to do is it's had a positive impact on our employee relations. It allows us, if we have an early stage grievance or an early stage dispute with 2 employees or more than 2 employees, what it means we can do is get somebody in to try and resolve it before that matter progresses to a more formal grievance process, which is obviously very costly and tends to lead to the situation getting worse, much worse in some cases. So we involve UK Mediation at an early stage, not in all disputes, but if we believe the dispute has got quite complex or is likely to get complex, then we tend to use the services of UK Mediation. The trade unions are very supportive of our relationship with UK Mediation, which is good. And I think as they've seen us follow through with cases and they've seen the success rate that we've had with UK Mediation, they've gained confidence. I think there was a little bit of scepticism at the outset, but I think we've got the buy-in of the trade unions. We do have in-house mediators. I'm trained myself, and I do mediations on occasion, but what you tend to find is that there can be a perception that you're part of the management structure and that perhaps you're not completely independent, which is where the UK Mediation are really helpful, because they are seen as being completely independent of the university and of the situation, and I think can therefore provide a resolution. I don't know how many cases we've used UK Mediation for, but their success rate has been very, very high, and situations where we might perhaps have ended up in a very, very complex grievance or even tribunal, we have resolved early on in the process. My caseworker, that's my main contact, is Becky. She's very, very responsive. If a dispute happened today, and we wanted to get it resolved, there's a likelihood that we could get a mediator in early next week. So the resolution time is very, very quick, which has benefits, that the situation doesn't get worse. So we have various scenarios where we use UK Mediation. We have some situations, the majority of situations are 2 people in dispute. And that we need to try and find a resolution. We do on occasion have 2 or 3 people, 4 or 5 people. We've had a situation where there's been 8 or 9 people involved in an ongoing dispute, and UK Mediation have been able to support us in those situations, either with 1 mediator or 2 mediators, a co-mediation, whichever is appropriate. So there's a variety of scenarios and disputes that UK Mediation have been able to provide support with. There are some situations when we're not sure whether mediation is appropriate, and in those situations I would ring Rebecca and ask for her advice, as she usually contacts one of the mediators and seeks some guidance and comes back to us, but she's very, very responsive. We usually have a response on the same day as to whether they think mediation is an appropriate way forward to resolve the situation. Overall, I'm delighted with the service UK Mediation provide. They've provided resolution to a huge number of situations that have arisen over the past 7 or 8 years within the university. Situations that could have gone much, much further, to a grievance, to a tribunal, but UK Mediation have helped us resolve them at that early stage, which from an employee relations perspective, as well as costs and just keeping teams functioning well, is really an excellent result. So I think we'll continue to have that relationship with UK Mediation moving forward.
So
we've been using
Samantha Burkitt from Liverpool John Moores University talking about how they've introduced mediation into their organisation. I think it's interesting, again, sorry it's a bit promotional, but she's worked with us over this long period of time. I find it's interesting they've got this really good combination of doing it for themselves and bringing in external mediators when needed. So Samantha herself does do mediations. There's one or two other people within John Moores who will offer facilitated conversations, I guess we'd call it, where you're using the mediation skills but not setting it up as a fully fledged sort of structured mediation process, but just getting people in for a chat with the door closed and using mediation skills to bring about a resolution. So they do that, facilitated conversations, plus they do their own internal mediation. Samantha does a few of those, and there are a few other people within John Moores that do it. And then when they need to, they bring in external mediators. So we go in there and provide that extra layer of independence, an extra sort of perception of impartiality that the participants can trust, perhaps over and above what they might trust of their own internal mediators. I say perception because their own mediators are completely trustworthy, but in the minds of the participants it feels more reassuring to bring people in from the outside. Supposing then that you were thinking about introducing mediation into your own organisation. So here's what you could do. You could use external mediators for one-off cases, bring us in. We could have this extra level, perception of this extra level of independence and impartiality. So we've got no prior contact with the participants. We're not employed by the university. So in we go, we do the mediation, we come out again, and just use the mediators on demand. So we've got a turnaround time of under 2 weeks. Use us as you need us. In we go, do the mediation cases, off we go again. Or you can use your own in-house mediation service. Here's a picture from one of our in-house mediation training courses, actually, with our trainer Neil stood at the back there. So you can build your own in-house mediation service. Get yourself a level 4 externally accredited qualification. It's great because you can have your own mediators on hand to resolve disputes as soon as they occur. So you've got your mediators within the university, perhaps drawn from different levels, different grades within the university, different faculties. And you can draw on them and their services as and when disputes arise. So you don't need to be paying external mediators. You've got your trained and accredited own mediation force internally. You can get them to resolve disputes very quickly. And we can help you to get all set up basically without going into detail. If we've got it, you can have it. All the forms and documents, policies, protocols, advice and support so that you can get that going. And we also, when we train you to have your own internal mediation service with your own mediators, we give you unlimited telephone and email support for life. So you can come back to us at any time with advice on cases, selection of cases, triage and assessment. Also any critical issues that come up within cases, you just call us, email us, and if we've trained you, you get that lifetime support with us. So there we go. I'll zip over that bit quickly because I'm a bit uncomfortable about doing promotional stuff when I'm doing webinars. However, what you can do also is look at equipping your staff with practical skills, training in conciliation and mediation for complaints handling, quite a mouthful. Consistent with what the OIA recommends. I was saying earlier, as about 2,000 cases went up to the OIA in 2018. What the OIA often does is bat them back down for local resolution. So most universities are onto this. They're very, very good at local resolution. But if you want to get some extra skills in conciliation or mediation for complaints handling so that you can satisfy what the OIA wants of you, we can train you in that. And also we can train your managers to this level of being able to do facilitated conversations, resolving disputes at an early and local level using the skills of mediation, but without having to do the whole highfalutin structured mediation process. So we can do you a 2-day course on that, a very, very popular course across the HE sector. And training frontline workers as well. So your registry workers, your HR staff, your welfare officers, train them in the skills of mediation, really good for nipping situations in the bud. Residence officers as well for dealing with stuff within halls of residence. These are the kind of things that we can train you in. So I said I was going to talk for 40 minutes, and according to my clock, that's 39 minutes. So if I go on to this last slide, just as it ticks over 40 minutes, and say any questions, anything you'd like to comment on or ask us about as a result of what we've talked about today with regard to using mediation in the higher education sector. I've got a question, I've got a few questions actually. Here's one from Alexandra. It's come in by email, who says, we often have problems with groups of students in accommodation where some are having exams, others have finished their exams and they're staying up late. And I presume, Alexandra, you're talking about them partying and making noise. Would mediation help? Yes, indeed. It's a very common one. And where we've trained residence officers, let me think of a couple of universities. Aston University in Birmingham, for example, had some training on this, to train the residence officers to go along there and basically, you know, not just to do what I'd call conflict management, which is about addressing a situation there and then, but the following day, get the students in the kitchen, propping up the worktop, get them to have a better conversation, get them to realise the impact of their own words and behaviours on the other residents in the block and within their flat, and use mediation skills to facilitate a conversation between them. So yes, indeed, before we get into the stages of formal sanctions or students being in trouble, if we can mediate at that point and try and get them to patch it up so that they're not disturbing each other, so that people can engage in their preferred lifestyles but without disturbing others and without falling out, because if they're not addressed, these situations can go to quite a bad place, really. So I hope that answers your question, Alexandra. Got another one from Arjun. Arjun, thank you very much for that. So they've got a department, says Arjun, who've been at loggerheads for over a year. We've had one-to-one mediations, presumably between some individuals within the department. But when would you consider getting them all together? Well, I would, Arjun, at the earliest stage, really. So if you believe that it's going to be helpful to get everybody together within that team, if there's a staff conflict, some disputes amongst the whole team, I think it's really helpful to get everybody together. I think when you have team mediations, definitely the whole is more than the sum of the parts. And to have a team resolution that we're going to try and work more collaboratively, work more cooperatively. If things do come up, here's how we're going to address them. I see some quite profound and enduring agreements come out in team mediations, rather bigger than you would get if it was just one-to-one mediations. Sometimes within teams, the conflict is focused on 2 or 3 parties, and we need to look at resolving their more high-temperature conflict. But sometimes it's much more helpful at the earliest stage as well, Arjun, to take it out to the whole team. Question from Christos. Thank you, Christos. Those who are trained as mediators, is this their only job? No, indeed, Christos. So what they do is they would have other jobs within the university. So a particular university I've got in mind, one of their mediators works in admissions, one is the chaplain. There are 2 academic staff, there's a teaching fellow, there's a research fellow, and these form the panel of mediators. So typically, Christos, they would be doing about, I would say around about 6 cases a year, something like that. So it doesn't interfere too much with their day jobs, as it were. And they do have sign-off from their managers to be able to undertake the training and then to be released for doing mediation cases, and also to come to the case supervision groups that we run. So they've got their normal jobs within the university. They do this as an add-on with their manager's permission. And again, thinking of that particular university, it's a really great cohort of mediators from different levels, grades, different places around the university, which helps with the selection of mediators so that we can make sure that the people who are coming into mediation don't know the mediator, they don't have any prior relationship. So we can choose from amongst this very diverse pool of mediators. We can choose mediators who aren't known and don't have any prior relationship with the parties. So very good question, Christos. Thank you very much for that. And I'll do one more so we don't run over too much and eat into your time, which is a question by email from Paul. Paul, thank you. We have an investigation running, says Paul, regarding allegations against a program manager, program leader, and they've suggested mediation. How do you manage this? Well, it is a very good question, because I think what we prefer is that if you can get mediation in before you start your investigation, that's the preferred scenario. But if you feel the need to do your investigation first, then you need to bring that to a conclusion before you do your mediation. They are very much processes that work in opposition. So an investigation is very much evidence-based. It's based on witness statements and documentary evidence. It's often about proving that a wrong has been committed. It's often about attributing blame and fault. And what we're doing in mediation is very much focused on the future rather than the past. It's not about evidence, it's about perceptions and people's experiences of each other. And it's intended to come up with a win-win solution rather than what you would get in an investigation, which is very much a win-lose solution. So in short, the process of investigation, which is evidential, past focused and to do with attributing blame and fault, is completely at odds with what we're trying to achieve in mediation. So my recommendation would be, if you haven't managed to get mediation in first, then what you need to do is to conclude your investigation completely, let the findings be published, do whatever needs done as a result of the investigation, and then do mediation. But you can't mix the two up. And just one final question that's come in, which is from Ilan. Ilan, thank you very much. What's the best way to approach mediation for a dispute that involves a large group of people, i.e. how to decide who should be present? Well, it's a good question, and my short answer, Ilan, is to say you involve everybody who is part of the resolution. So if there is a large group, anybody who can contribute to bringing about a resolution should be included and should be treated equally. People attend on their own, they speak for themselves. We don't have representatives or advocates. We don't have lawyers, we don't have trades union representatives present in order to support people's versions of events. What we do have is individuals attending on their own, speaking for themselves, everybody will be treated equally. And in terms of the selection of participants, Ilan, I would include anybody who is potentially part of the solution, which can mean you end up with a lot of people. But if that's going to bring out a more enduring solution, it's a very good investment of time and effort because it future-proofs those relationships and makes sure that if you included everybody, then everybody is going to put their shoulder behind the consensual agreement and make sure that it works way into the future. So thanks very much for those questions. Very, very good questions today. Thank you. There's a few more by email, but I better move on. And just to say that round the corner, we've got a few more webinars and events coming up. The one that's particularly pertinent for HE is about a presentation that I'm doing with Samantha Burkett. This is in May this year, plenty of warning here, at the university's HR annual conference, which we're doing it twice on Wednesday 20th of May. So anybody who's going to the UHR conference, I look forward to seeing you there. And we're talking about differing approaches to conflict. What you give is what you get. I'm sort of talking with Samantha about the sort of culture of collaborative conflict resolution, about if we approach conflict in a particular way, then we're going to get particular results. So do join us in May for that. Date for your diary. We've got a webinar coming up about mediation in local authorities. I can see one or two people on today. This may be of particular interest to you. This is coming up in February. And we've got one about workplace bullying, which again, it would be pertinent to some issues that come up within the HE sector. Workplace bullying, and this is in March. And then we have, for those of you who want to see what mediation really looks like, another of our free events is happening in April. We've got an online showcase, which is, it's quite a unique event. It's about looking at the structure, the anatomy of a real mediation case, where two parties fall out at work, and we see what happens with the individual meetings and what the mediator does in those meetings, and then progressing through a truncated mediation case. We don't show the whole thing because it would take hours, but it's a sort of an abbreviated walk through the steps and stages of a mediation case, right from the conflict happening at the beginning, through the individual meetings, through the group joint meeting rather, right up to the point of writing up the agreement at the end of the mediation. So that's a great one if you're less familiar with mediation and how it works. You can really see it in action on our online showcase, which is in April this year. So there we go, I'm going to finish for today. Do keep in touch with us. If you're not already subscribing to our YouTube channel, do please do that, and you can like the video of this webinar on that channel. Follow us on Twitter, take a look at us on LinkedIn, and check out our Facebook as well. So I'm going to finish for today. Thank you very much. I'll put that screen back up in a second so that you can note that down. If you want to recommend this to anybody, they can find it on YouTube. If you want to see it again, it should be up on YouTube by the end of this afternoon. Have a look at that. And in the meantime, thanks very much for watching our webinar, Mediation in Higher Education. This is Dr. Mike Talbot signing off. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you soon.